Welcome once again to the Spring Hill Church of Christ, meeting at 405 Butler Street, Spring Hill, Louisiana. I want to start out looking at this chart. Spring in the wilderness, invasion and conquest under Joshua, the judges, starting with Othniel, going all the way through to Samuel. And now we're in the United Kingdom, where we'll see the kingdoms of Saul, David, and Solomon. Then we'll continue on through the rest of the time periods to the end of the Bible. Now, here are some important historical dates from the Old Testament, beginning with creation of the universe all the way down to the temple and the Jerusalem wall being rebuilt. Our Bible timeline, once again, to show us the different dates that we're studying in the Old Testament. And of course, we're talking about our kings under the United Kingdom, Saul, David, and Solomon, and then the divided kingdom that occurs under Rehoboam, Jeroboam, after the death of Solomon. So with that, we're looking at this United Kingdom period currently. We have some other periods that will come in, the divided kingdom, where we get into the literary prophets, Joel, Obadiah, Jonah, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah under the divided kingdom. And then we have 721, Assyria goes into captivity. And then, of course, Babylon will go into captivity, 3 deportations, 605 BC, 597, and 586, Daniel going into captivity, of course, in 605 BC. There's the prophets that prophesied during this time period. The return from captivity, starting with Zerubbabel, Ezra going to teach the people the law, and then Nehemiah going to rebuild the wall. So with that in mind, we're in the United Kingdom. Here is a map that shows Saul's kingdom in the lighter color. David's kingdom is in the darker color. Here's a chart of the books that are during the United Kingdom: 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles, and 1st Kings. The book of poetry, of course, some of the Psalms were written during this time period. We have 1st Samuel at a glance, and of course, we are currently in the reign of Saul. The rule of judges has come to an end, and the people have asked for a king, of course, Saul being the first king. When he starts out, he's shy, he's strong, he's good looking, and we see he's anointed, or oil is poured on his head in a private ceremony. So we've gone through these judges, and the last judge, of course, was Samuel. And here is, from Bible Projects, a chart showing the both of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel on one chart. A timeline showing us the birth of Samuel all the way to David's rule over Israel. And of course, the life of Samuel. We talked about this chart last week. So we are in the kings of the United Kingdom. We are coming near to the end of Saul's reign. He has been rejected from being king. Samuel has went and anointed David to be king, his successor after him. No one in Saul's family will be a part of the kingdom once again. Have looked at the reign of King Saul, and we've looked at his early successes, and now we're into his failures, and particularly this time, we want to notice his decline and fall. The causes and the results: first of all, a presumptive sacrifice, and the result of that was the loss of his kingdom foretold, chapter 13, verse 14, a foolish curse. It falls on Jonathan, chapter 14, verse 24 and 44, and then he spares Agag, king of the Amalekites, and the crops, which ultimately causes a loss of his kingdom. So we see parallels between Jonathan and David as we study this. Chapter 17 is a complete story told so dramatically one can easily imagine it, like the stories of Jonathan's exploits being related over and over again by young soldiers as they pass time in the evening around the campfire. There are remarkable parallels between Jonathan's actions described in chapter 14 and David's actions here. Both are portrayed as activists and courageously standing out of the crowd and ignoring any personal danger. Both are convinced of the reality of God's power and his willingness to intervene on behalf of his people. In both cases, the action led to major defeat of the Philistines. The picture of the battle scene given here is realistic. Two opposing forces lined up and two facing hillsides with a valley in between, preventing either side from instituting an ambush or initiating an unexpected attack. The town's names here are well south of the area mentioned in previous battles with the Philistines on the edge of Philistia itself. It was known for the sides to send out their champion to fight on their behalf, and the side whose champion was defeated would then withdraw their claim to whatever territory was at that time being disputed. The Philistine champion was a huge man from Gath named Goliath. Some manuscripts say he was 9.5 feet tall. Other manuscripts say he was 4 cubits or 6'6". But besides that, normal people at this time were around 5 foot. He had a coat of mail weighing 200 pounds. His weaver's beam was 24 feet long and was 15 pounds. So with that kind of as a background, let's get into this chapter 17 and see what goes on in this battle. Verse 1 begins, "Now Philistines gathered their army for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephesus-Dammon." And of course, here this map shows us the area that we are talking about. There's the area Gath, and there's Elah in this valley. Verse 2, "Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah." We just saw on the map Elah there. "Drew up in lines of battle against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. There came out of the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits, as we've said, 9.5 feet in our imperial measurement, and a span, so that would be 9.5. In verse 5, "He had a helmet of bronze on his head and was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, roughly 200 pounds. He had a bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, 15 pounds. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, 'Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself, and let him come down to me.'" So there's what we have in this scripture. Now, the extent and weight of Goliath's armor, given the scarcity of such resources, may indicate that his appearance was intended to frighten the Israelites, and there was no real expectation that he would even have to fight. Just the terror of him would cause them to flee the battle scene. And so he says in verse 9, if he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. The Philistine said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And when Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And of course, the Israelite army certainly were overawed, and although they didn't actually surrender or withdraw, neither Saul nor anyone else had any idea what to do next. They were in fear of all this. Into this situation steps the young David. Apparently not old enough to join the army, but certainly old enough to travel independently. Let's read the rest of the story. Now David was the son of an Ephraimite of Bethlehem in Judea named Jesse, who had 8 sons. Now we could go back and we understand that Jesse was a descendant of Ruth. Remember Ruth and Boaz that we studied? He was Ruth's grandson. And so in the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. And the 3 oldest sons of Jesse followed Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn. Next to him was Benadad, and the third was Shema. David was the youngest. The 3 elders followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And so we have in verse 16, for 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening, challenging them to come out to battle. Verse 17, Jesse said to David his son, take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their thousands, and see if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them. Now Saul and they and all of the men were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle lines, shouting the war cry. So the Israelite army certainly were overawed. But now when we get down here and we talk about David as an individual, he was enthusiastic, he was patriotic, a youngster, overconfident perhaps, but one with complete faith, we're going to see, in the power of God. He introduces the concept, forgotten or ignored by Saul and his troops, that they were the armies of the living God. We'll see that when we get to verse 26. Israel and the Philistines drew up the battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brother. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, that is, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines, spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. Verse 26, David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach of Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way. so it shall be done to the man who kills him. Now Eliab, the eldest brother of David, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. So the embarrassed and annoyed reaction of David's brother can surely be seen here. His intending criticism of an arrogant boy brings an earthly reality to the account. When David's persistence did eventually bring him into Saul's presence, it is a sign of Saul's desperation, that he would listen even to the views of a boy like David. David says to his brother, What have I done now? Was it not a word? And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him, and David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped on his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. And then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And unwilling to use anything other than the resources which he is competent to use and through which he has known God's help on previous occasions. That's what we see here in verse 40. Now, God's help is going to prove to be sufficient for David. So we've set this up. We've seen that David is not going to be able to use the armor that Saul provides him. David has chosen what he can use, his sling and 5 smooth stones. So let's look at verse 41. Verse 41 now. The Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. So now we have 2 contrasting champions drawing near, each for different reasons, despising the other, both speaking of their own gods, and it was perhaps the improbability of David as an attacker that made it easier for him to defeat the Goliath. The message of Samuel, that the Lord does not look at the things people look at in chapter 16, verse 17, that we have studied before, certainly comes to mind and is relevant. Goliath saw an inexperienced young man. The Philistines said to David, "Am I a dog and you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistines said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." And he says that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. David's words make it clear that he was fighting in God's name. And with God's help, as far as David was concerned, his actions was a sign not of his own greatness, but of God's power. It would indicate to everybody, Philistine and Israelite, the extent of God's sovereignty, and that he needed neither army nor armor nor armament to defend his cause. God's honor had been offended by the Israelites' army's inaction, but would be restored and proclaimed by God's own actions through David. And what was important was for David to recognize and them to recognize their dependence on God and God's dependability. The Philistines, whose dependence had been on their massive champion, and were unready or unwilling to fight further. Verse 48, when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, and slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, struck the Philistine and killed him, and there was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of his sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The two contrasting champions have drawn near. The Philistines, whose dependence had been on their massive champion, they were unready or unwilling to fight further. After David's victory, the Israelite army, fear and dismay, now forgotten, follow up, drive the Philistines further back into their own territory. David cuts off Goliath's head and brings it back into camp. The men of Israel rose with a shout. The people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines. They plundered their camp. The people of Israel chasing the Philistines, plundering their camp. David took the head of the Philistine, brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." Now at this point, 1755, Saul sends Abner, his cousin and general, to find out who this young man is. Now, verse 55, we see that's what's being said. Now, in verse 57, as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant, Jesse the Bethlehemite." Next week in our study, in our next lesson, we'll study 1 Samuel chapter 18 through chapter 25. And with that, cheerio, mate. Bob's your uncle. If you found this video helpful and wish to learn more, be sure you download the note card that goes with this lesson and our free 4-lesson Bible correspondence course. You will find the links in the description below. We here at the Spring Hill Church of Christ, meeting at 405 Butler Street in Spring Hill, Louisiana, want to help you with your growth in your knowledge of God's Word. Remember, we are in it for the likes and the subs, so be sure to like us, subscribe to our channel, and tell others. Thanks for watching. In the meantime, in between time, we will see you next time. Cheerio, mate. And with that, Bob's your uncle.